Good evening, everyone. We are delighted to welcome each of you to our progressive hour. And as you are populating the stream, if you could just put in the chat your name, where you are from, just so we know a bit of who's in the room. Come on in the room. Welcome to this very special, urgent, progressive hour as we think deeply together as humans, as people who are of high conscience, people who love humanity, and people who are radically committed to liberation as an article of faith. I am Willie Francois. I serve as the co-chair of the Social Justice Commission for the Progressive National Baptist Convention, and delighted to serve as moderator this evening as we think about what Black churches can do in this very crucial moment, this watershed moment, where dignity is being denied, where a place that we call the Holy Land is becoming a place of flesh waste, a place of inhospitality and radical violence and terror. And it is important to name that the Progressive National Baptist Convention, led by Reverend David Peoples, has been a voice in this space of peace and liberation in that region. For some time in 2019, we passed a resolution in support of the Palestinian struggle for liberation, the Palestinian struggle for recognition. And we reaffirm those commitments today, even as we hold space as pastors, we hold space as faith leaders, as leaders of faith, who again are radically committed to what it means to practice a witness of liberation and practice the ministry of presence, even when we're not able to be present. And we have several experts, several leaders who are joining us today. Excited about each of them, and I will say a bit about them as we prepare for our introduction. But this is an attempt for us to educate and mobilize Black churches broadly across denominations, to think about our role in education, our role in advocacy, and knowing that a threat to human life anywhere is a threat to human life everywhere. Bombs that fall on any shore have implications on these shores. And as people who understand what our role as followers, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, as followers of Jesus, a denomination that was founded in pursuit of Black liberation here in this country, a denomination that grows out of a need for a Baptist anchor in the nonviolence wing of the civil rights movement. That is the heritage that brings us to this moment. That is the heritage that does not allow us to avert our eyes as death making happens on other shores. It is a heritage that must be willing to call out the ways that death that happens in Palestine-Israel is also blood on the hands of the American government, blood on that should be placed blame at the feet of the White House and also on the steps of our Capitol. We know that violence begets violence, damning us to closed circuits of tear-stained cheeks and blood-soaked streets. The horrors in what we call the Holy Land carry longer, more complex history than our anemic biblical misreadings and also what the corporatized media exposes to us. We're witnessing a logical step, tragically, a logical step in a long nightmare of colonialism on one side and terror from a faction on the other side, small faction on the other side. So as we grieve and repudiate what has been the logic and violence of Hamas, we must also grieve the loss of Palestinian people, the loss of Palestinian freedom, and the loss of Palestinian futures. To be clear, Hamas does not represent the people of Palestine, just as the people of Israel are bigger and more moral than their government, the same way any people are bigger and more moral than most governments. And so the entire region is bomb laden and missile prone because of the hate that hate produces. And tonight, we will talk about these complexities. We will wade our way through nuances. We will figure out what our calls to action will be, but we will also affirm and reassert the omni love of God, whether we call God God, whether we call God Yahweh, whether we call God Allah. We believe in the omni love of God, and the history of war and displacement, bomb and bloodshed lead directly to these shores. And we are clear that only love can chase out hate. Only love can chase out hate. And that is what we believe as people of faith, as followers of the carpenter from Palestine, as people who understand that we are followers of a man who was damned and killed by his own government, which was a settler colonial government known as the Roman Empire. We'll start with prayer, and then we will continue with prayer, and then I will introduce our brothers and our sisters, our siblings that will lead us in conversation. O God of liberation and God of peace, God who reminds us that human flesh is sacred, it is not disposable, discardable, it is not bombable, it's not punishable, but lovable. May we carry into today and many more days our fierce commitment to human life, our fierce commitment to the dignity of all flesh, our fierce commitment to peace. And yes, in the tradition of so many prophets, the tradition of so many freedom fighters, a radical love of nonviolence. We offer this prayer in the wake of so much devastation and destruction, in the wake of missiles and alarms, as mothers and children and fathers, brothers and sisters face perilous uncertainty and angst with very little place and recourse to turn to for respite, for food, for the essentials that make life move forward. But we also approach this moment with a wild imagination that peace is possible in our lifetime.
Mm.
We move forward carrying with us, coded in our bodies, the conviction that we are the answers that we have been looking for. We approach this moment knowing for sure that there is another way if we only have the political will and the moral courage to choose love, public love, over self-interest and colonialism and governmentalism. We believe it is possible because we believe in you, God, who is radically committed to our liberation and to our wholeness. It is in the name of liberation, in the name of love, in the name of life that we pray this prayer. Amen. So grateful that we have joining us today 4 panelists that will lead us in ways that they feel led and directed. Uh, People who have varying but clear relationships with the region, whether as one who has immersed themselves in pilgrimage, one who has been committed to this fight more broadly. We are excited that we have Jonathan Kutab, who is with us today, who is the executive director of Friends of Seville, North America. We are grateful to have the Reverend Dr. Leslie Callahan, who serves as the first female pastor of St. Paul's Baptist Church in Philadelphia. Grateful to have Donna Neville, a community psychologist and educator, and who is the co-director of the PAR CEO, an education and research center that recently completed a curriculum on anti-Semitism from a framework of collective liberation. And we have the Reverend Dr. Niall Fort, who's a minister, activist, scholar, and a professor of African American and African diaspora studies at Columbia University in New York City. I'm going to turn our attention now to Brother Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Reverend Willie. I feel very much grateful and supported and supportive of what you have said. I speak today with a heavy heart because of the ongoing events. Even the last couple of hours have seen a major massacre with a hospital in Gaza, what used to be called the Baptist Hospital, that has been hit, and with hundreds of people martyred there. But I also want to say that we really need spend a little time on context. The events of this war taking place right now in Gaza didn't start on October 7th, obviously. They are in many ways the logical progression of what's happened. When the State of Israel was created in 1948, largely as a response to anti-Semitism in the West, it obtained a lot of support to create a Jewish state. And once the Western world accepted that premise, that they wanted to create a state as Jewish as France is French, it was inevitable that it becomes an apartheid regime, because that place wasn't empty. There was already a people living there that had to be elbowed aside, pushed off, turned into refugees, and whatever number remained in the land had to be ruled and oppressed in the name of keeping the place Jewish. So we start with a regime that necessarily was going to be racist and discriminatory towards the local people, because it openly wanted to be a Jewish state in a place that was already fully populated by non-Jews. In 1967, another development took place where this state captured the rest of historic Palestine, which it wanted to make part of its state, but it did not want to annex it immediately because that would create demographic problems. So it ruled it under a military occupation that started in 1967 and continues to this day. Part of the process of control and occupation required the fragmentation of the local society. Those who are outside its borders were not its concerns. They are refugees. Those who were living under military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza also had to be fragmented. And Gaza became this open air prison where for the last 16 years there has been an ongoing siege that gets relaxed a little bit sometimes and tightened a little bit sometimes. But basically, the entire area was under the control of Israeli power, which controlled everything that came in, everything that came out, people and goods, electricity, water, fuel, and food was very calibrated to allow them to continue to be ruled. Permits to go in to the rest of Palestine to work were doled out based on good behavior. In fact, the situation was so tight, the UN said it's going to be unlivable by the year 2020. And here we are in the year 2023, when finally that pressure cooker exploded into the violence of October 7, which we must remember was both a violence against Israeli soldiers and bases, which were captured and over 250 soldiers killed, but also against civilians in that area. And that is to be rejected, of course. Civilians should not be targeted, should not be taken as hostages. And that is wrong, and that is even probably a war crime as well. But then the Western media set in and created this new paradigm. Hamas, the leader of the Gaza Strip at the time, then becomes totally and thoroughly demonized. It is an expression of pure evil that needs to be eliminated and destroyed. Now, the more sophisticated Israeli propagandists will say we're only talking about Hamas and specifically about the terrorists, the armed groups. But that the reality is that that designation, that demonization extended not only to the fighters who are called terrorists, but also to the entire governmental structure and, in fact, to the entire population of Gaza. And once you accept that designation, that your enemy, however you define him, is pure evil, they are human animals, they are totally devoid of humanity, and therefore need to be eliminated, eradicated, wiped out, then everything else follows. Then when you cut off the water and electricity and food totally, not just regulate it, to the entire 2 million people there, it's legitimate because you're trying to eliminate that evil. And if they are underground that you need to go in and eliminate them, you can order 1.1 million people to leave their homes. Forced transfer, illegal under any international law. An expression of genocidal crime. That becomes almost a humanitarian gesture. We're trying to move them out of harm's way. Even while you were bombing them as they're leaving, and we're bombing the areas to which they are leaving, that is all somehow becomes acceptable. And for 10 days now, we've been watching 24/7 expressions of the humanity and sympathy for those who were in fact captured and taken as hostages, and those who were killed. And we build a certain view of the other as the evil ones. The president of Israel made it very clear. There's no such thing as innocents, civilians. They should have risen against that government and against Hamas and kicked them out through a coup d'etat. Therefore, they are all guilty. They are not innocent. The entire population is now available as targets. And if we tell them to leave and they don't, well, it's their fault. And if we bomb them, it's because we are trying to eradicate this evil. And if we can't explain why we bomb them, we blame them. We blame the victims for what we are doing. According to Israeli statistics, in the first 6 days, they dropped over 6,000 missiles and bombs, more than the United States has dropped during 1 year in Afghanistan, more than the bombs that were dropped throughout the Libyan war. All of it in 6 days in a small, tiny area that's only 20 miles long and between 5 and 8 miles wide, with 2.3 million of God's children living there. Half of them children, because the median age in Gaza is 16. 50,000 women are pregnant. And when you're pregnant, your pregnancy doesn't care whether there are bombs falling or not. You need to take care of that baby. You need to have diapers. You need to have food. But you have no electricity, no water, and no food. And in fact, you are being slowly pushed away out of that land. How is that possible? How can that happen? And how can the media create a situation where those victims are demonized and their oppressors are glorified, and where you need to show sympathy? And if you dare show any kind of sympathy to the other side, why, you are being evil, anti-Semitic, supporting terrorism, even if you are yourself totally a believer in nonviolence like myself. Even if you're advocating BDS, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. In Europe now, in a number of countries, hopefully not yet in the United States, it is becoming illegal, possibly criminal, to fly a Palestinian flag. In this country, if you dare speak up for Palestinians, you are attacked. And if you are tolerated at all, you start by saying, are you willing to condemn Hamas and their barbaric acts? And if you're not, or if you're not doing it sufficiently vigorously, then clearly you are not worthy of speaking to. I come to you today. I don't know how much time I still have, but I want to assert that Palestinians are human beings. Can you imagine the radical assertion? That I myself, by the grace of God, am a Christian and a pacifist. I don't believe in violence, but I do believe in justice, and I do believe in human rights, and I do believe in equality as a virtue. And I do believe that while it is wrong and sinful to hate Jews or Judaism or to be anti-Semitic, it is equally wrong to hate Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians, or to accept a system of apartheid that grants Jews, the victims of yesterday, power and domination over another group who happen not to be Jewish. We are all God's children, and we must learn to believe in that humanity and equality. And if we do, yes, it is possible to have peace. because violence will not give you peace or security. You can send another 2 aircraft carriers there if you wish, and have the Marines come in and send in US soldiers or weapons or technology. In the end, Israelis and Palestinians need to learn to live and work together. Only that way can they achieve security and freedom and equality. Thank you very much, Brother Willie.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Sister Donna?
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you this evening. And thank you to Jonathan Kutab, whose work I have long admired, for your moral clarity, for your courage for so long, and for your words that are so important for each of us to hear and to know, and most importantly, to act upon. As we've heard, the Israeli government is inflicting unbearable violence and destruction directed to the people of Gaza and at all of Gaza at this very moment. Unconscionable is not really a strong enough word for today's bombing of a hospital with several hundred murdered. I am coming to this call from a protest. It's still happening in front of our senator's office in Miami, where I live, calling upon him to tell the US government to demand a call at this moment for a ceasefire, to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza, and to stop funding this genocide. I know we are all committed to ensuring that each and every person has the right to live in peace and with justice and dignity. I am a Jewish woman living in the US whose deep commitment to justice comes from my parents, who taught me not only from their words, but by example in how they lived their lives, that there is nothing holier than treating each and every person with respect, with love, and with compassion. I am a passionate believer in the power of collective learning and exploration. The center I am part of, Parseo, believes that community education is critically important to our work for justice, not as an add-on to our organizing, but as fundamental to it. Through this process, we can learn together, challenge ourselves, and feel more emboldened to go out and organize and to speak to our communities as effectively and with as much principle as possible. I was asked and am pleased to share with you a bit about the curriculum we recently created on challenging anti-Semitism from a framework of collective liberation. The curriculum grew out of calls from our social justice partners and from educators who wanted resources that didn't look at anti-Semitism in isolation, but rather understands that anti-Semitism deeply connects to and intersects with other systems of injustice. At a moment when white nationalism and white nationalist violence is growing and harming so many of our communities, we know there is a real need for this kind of an undertaking. The curriculum explores Jewish histories and different experiences of anti-Semitism and looks at how anti-Semitism intersects and has intersected with other forms of injustice throughout history. We understand that Jews reflect racially, ethnically, economically, and culturally diverse communities, experiences, and histories, and have lived throughout the globe for centuries. We also look at anti-Semitism historically in the US and how it manifests today through increasing white nationalist violence, through tropes and stereotypes, conspiracy theories, philo-Semitism, and other ways. While it is critically important to understand what anti-Semitism is, and we explore that throughout the curriculum, equally important is to understand what anti-Semitism is not. The misuse of anti-Semitism and charges of anti-Semitism directed at those fighting for justice for the Palestinian people added another layer of urgency to this project. Organized campaigns are derailing and misstating the meaning of anti-Semitism and falsely conflating it with criticism of Israel. This tactic, used by opponents of Palestinian rights over the years, has become intensified as the movement for justice has grown. It is not discriminatory in any way to hold a nation state accountable for its human rights abuses and for violations of international law. There is nothing anti-Semitic about that in any rational definition of anti-Semitism. Our hope is that this curriculum, which is situated within a framework of collective liberation, will build from and contribute to the broader work for justice and the resistance happening in so many ways across the country and across the globe. When I was a child, my parents used to tell me that never again, a powerful pledge we learned after the Holocaust, meant never again for anybody, and that we had an obligation to speak out against injustice whenever it reared its ugly head. That is why fighting anti-Semitism from a framework of collective liberation and understanding that the struggle for justice in Palestine goes hand in hand with challenging all forms of injustice, including anti-Semitism, is the only way I can see fighting it that is consistent with my principles and commitments to justice. As Rabbi Brant Rosen of Congregation Tzedek Chicago said after the shootings at the Tree of Light Synagogue in Pittsburgh, an important takeaway from this terrible, terrible, tragic moment is the simple truth that we must never underestimate the sacred power of solidarity. Movements such as these must remind all targeted moments such as these must remind all targeted minorities that we are always stronger when we resist together. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you would like to learn more about the curriculum and have us bring it to your communities. And I would like to close with a pledge I have committed myself to continue joining together with all those across the globe who are saying, we will not be silent in the face of injustice, to stand strong with the Palestinian people and the Palestinians of Gaza, with all those calling for an end to the occupation and oppression of Palestinians, to all those committed to equal rights for Palestinian and Israelis, and to justice and dignity for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. Dr. Callahan?
Thank you for convening this panel. Thanks to our president and to the Progressive National Baptist Convention for making this forum available. And many thanks to Donna and to Jonathan for your comments. I come here really in wearing three hats. I am not an expert on the geopolitical struggles or the history of Palestine, and I don't purport to be that. We have Jonathan here, whose expertise I have been privileged to glean from in a fairly intense way recently on a trip to Palestine. And we have Donna, whose work to ground our justice work in the fight against anti-Semitism. They are more expert. I'm here really as a Progressive National Baptist pastor who wants to say that people like us, those of us who are pastors and faith leaders, and particularly Christian pastors, and particularly Black Christian pastors, have a responsibility not to just look away. And what that means is, in a very significant sense, to attend to the ways that theology, biblical understandings and misunderstandings, bad theology, I would say, and biblical misunderstandings cause us to support behaviors that are frankly evil. I think that anyone with a modicum of decency would decry violence against children, would stand against and should stand against acts of terror, no matter who commits them. I think that our hearts ought to be moved by what we have witnessed and what we are witnessing collectively. But there's a difference when we only have the capacity to see the pain of one specific set of people, and even that for what I would argue are anti-Semitic reasons, which is that we have an idealized view and an instrumentalist understanding of who Israel is that is related to a particular set of theological beliefs. And that's not really about commitment. That's not really about a commitment to Israeli people or to Jewish people more broadly at all. And so I think as Christians in particular, we need to come to the table to learn more about the history of Palestine, about how the state of Israel came to be, about the kind of perniciousness that was involved in European and the United States, in Europe and the United States, unwillingness to protect Jewish people from Hitler in the first place, and then create safe spaces in the aftermath of World War II. And rather than to do that, they continued that they created what purported to be a space and a homeland for Jewish people, but that was really, again, not about actually caring about people. So Christians need to stop looking at the Holy Land and what is happening there through the lens of some self-interested hopes for the second coming of Jesus. So that we can actually have a conversation about what it means to live as human beings on a diverse planet. And I would say, for God's sake. The second reason I think it's important, and my interest has to do with being a citizen of the United States that has an outsized role in this conflict, and a peculiarly unhelpful one. To watch our elected officials consistently pledge their support. It was one thing on October 7th, before the war crimes in Gaza were escalating on a day-to-day basis. What is happening today is a scandal within our own government. Our complete incapacity to acknowledge Palestinian humanity in the midst of war crimes is something that anybody who is a citizen of the United States who cares about justice needs to say something about. Because that's being done in our name. We cannot say we're government of the people, by the people, and for the people only when our government acts in ways we like. We have a responsibility to call to account the people who represent us on both sides of the aisle for the ways that they represent us, spend our money, and act in our name to support policies that are inhumane. My last statement is, and that brings me to the real issue for me. Something is wrong with our humanity when we don't care about other people. And or when we only care about certain other people, where people's humanity itself is not enough to make us care about them. And again, I don't purport to have the answers, but I know that we don't get to any kind of sustainable answer for anybody in the region if we don't say what's true now. And so I am so thankful for people, again, like Jonathan, who are trying to help us to understand the context that we are observing, and who is trying to speak in a moral way as a Palestinian, but also for the sake of humanity. So thank you again. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Callahan. Dr. Ford?
First of all, I want to thank the Progressive National Baptist Convention for hosting this wonderful. We have more of these. The church might be all right. So maybe we just need to run this twice a week. I don't know how often y'all do it, but I'm going to definitely join for the next one. So I'm so excited to be here. Pastor Willie Francois III, my Morehouse brother, my brother in the cloth. I appreciate you for doing all the work that you do, running from here to there to make sure you get in your office on time to moderate such a wonderful conversation. Jonathan Katab, thank you for all the reasons that you already know. Jonathan made sure that myself, Pastor Leslie Callahan, and a group of amazing faith leaders made our way to Palestine to see for ourselves, not through the mainstream media, not through TikTok, not through Instagram, not through Twitter turn X or whatever it's called, but with our own eyes, walking the stony streets where Jesus walked, seeing how the once holy land has become so very unholy. Donna Neville, thank you for everything that you do. You are the model of what it looks like to be a person that roots for justice, fights for justice from the tradition, the best of the tradition that you learned, I know, from your father and your family, that beautiful Jewish tradition that you're rooted in. So thank you. And Pastor Leslie Callahan, you're my mentor, my friend, and I'm just so happy to have you here. I start that way because we're here in the name of love, y'all. We're going to go through some of the facts and the statistics, but the reason why we're here is because we come from a tradition that believes in love. And we know that we can't love God if we don't love all of God's children, as Pastor Callahan made very clear. We know we can't love our neighbor if we don't know what our neighbor's going through, as Jonathan Katab made clear. And we know we can't even love ourselves if we don't see our neighbor in ourselves. And so we're here to talk about that humanity. And we're also here to talk about the moral clarity that we need to gain from the political analysis that's so important. Our heart's got to be right and our head's got to be sharp. So I just want to share a little bit of a story that I actually didn't know anything about growing up. You know, I knew about Dr. King walking with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. I knew about the students in New York and up north making their way down south to protest and get Black people to register to vote in Mississippi and throughout the South. But I didn't know about this other story that I actually want to share today, and that's the story of Black-Palestinian solidarity. Black-Palestinian solidarity. So Palestine is an essential chapter of the story of the Black freedom struggle. Y'all already know we have a long tradition of Black folk, African descended people, on standing on the side of the oppressed across space and time. I actually think one of the miracles of Black people in the New World is that despite, perhaps even because of our own story of oppression, we've stood in solidarity with who Frantz Fanon called the damned of the earth, or the wretched of the earth. When Italy invaded Ethiopia, Black people, including the great Ella Baker, flooded the streets of Harlem to protest the imperial invasion. Right? When the British Crown ruled the Indian subcontinent, Black intellectuals, Black artists, I'm talking about W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, supported the Indian freedom struggle. When the United States went to war with Vietnam, Black freedom fighters like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out. That's when he called the American government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. From the pulpit of the Riverside Church in 1967, exactly 1 year before his head was blown off, on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. The same can be said today. Black activists, organizers, educators, students, faith leaders standing in solidarity with the landless farmers movement in Brazil, with the indigenous people protesting against Standing Rock, and of course, in Palestine. So it's important to remember, it's important for me to remember that this is all rooted in a deep understanding that our liberation, that Black people's liberation, is bound up in the liberation of all people. Fannie Lou Hamer probably said it better than any preacher could: nobody's free until everybody's free. So that's the broader context. But I also want to talk a little bit about what are the connections between Black people and Palestinian people. The first is very important. There are Black Palestinians, y'all. I did not know this till I went the first time. There are actual Black, would you believe it? There is a small but rich community of Afro-Palestinians who myself and Pastor Leslie Callahan and several of us with Jonathan Katab were able to visit ourselves and sit in their beautiful homes and listen to their stories. They live in the Muslim quarter of the old city. Many are religious pilgrims who've been integral to the Palestinian liberation struggle since the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. So when people ask, what I get asked this sometimes, why should Black people care about Palestinians? I always think to myself, this is kind of an ironic question that reveals how the rich diversity of Palestinian people has been buried and concealed beneath a language and ideology, as Pastor Willie Francois said, and Jonathan Katab, of othering. This is to say nothing about the about 10% of Palestinians who are also Christian. And we can get to why this is not a religious conflict. And I think we actually need to name that in this conversation. We can get to that in a minute. Black people's relationship to Zionism is complex, in part because of our intimate relationship with the biblical book of Exodus. Enslaved Africans, we read ourselves into that story, except we were the Israelites and America was Egypt. And like most people at the time, talk about the 1960s, before 1968, most Black activists saw Zionism as a national liberation project. But a lot of that began to change in 1967. You see a big shift with the beginning of what Jonathan Katab named as a military occupation, which is still firmly intact today. It is much bigger than what's happening in Gaza. We should also talk a little more about that. This was a tumultuous time in 1967. The country and throughout the world, the Vietnam War was raging. Third world countries have been fighting for independence from European colonial rule. So many Black freedom fighters begin to make connections between U.S. imperialism and Israeli colonization of Palestinian land. This is the time you begin to see more and more expressions of solidarity. The Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee's essay, Palestine Problem, framed Zionism as an imperial project upheld by the United States and Europe. The Black Panther Party understood Black communities in the U.S. as internal colonies, analogizing our struggle to the Palestinian freedom struggle. In 1965, just months before his assassination, Malcolm X went to Gaza and visited Palestinian refugee camps, which inspired his classic essay, Zionist Logic. And of course, figures such as James Baldwin, Angela Davis, Amiri Baraka, Toni Morrison, Muhammad Ali, and many more all stood in solidarity with the movement for justice in Palestine. But it's not just Black people who supported Palestinian people. Palestinians have also supported the Black freedom struggle. For example, the Association of Arab American University Graduates spotlighted the economic and military entanglements between Israel and apartheid South Africa. Or activist groups such as the Organization of Arab Students invited Stokely Carmichael to speak at their national convention, and they even lobbied Shirley Chisholm during her 1972 presidential run. Or Arab American activists formed an Arab Workers' Caucus in Michigan's auto factories, which were modeled off of Black labor organizations. And we see this long tradition show up again in 2014, when Palestinian activists taught Ferguson protesters, such as myself, how to respond to tear gas. So you have these connections. And then, of course, you have some serious political connections. All right. We can talk about policing. What I didn't know before I went to Palestine is that the militarization of police I experienced in Ferguson, the tanks, the tear gas, the riot gear, the weaponized repression, was not uniquely American. It was a product of a strategic repressive alliance between the state of Israel and the United States. In the aftermath of 9/11, Israel used its decades of military rule over Palestinians to market itself as a global leader in counterterrorism. The state of Israel's over 75 years of dispossession and over 50 years of occupation became a marketing brochure for successful policing. U.S. law enforcement agencies such as the NYPD, the LAPD, Seattle PD, Ferguson and St. Louis PD, just to name a few, helped bolster the idea of Israel's expertise by participating in exchange programs with Israel. So the modern day lynching, this is what I'm trying to say, the modern day lynching of Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Tamir Rice, the list goes on, is inseparable from the extrajudicial killings of hundreds of Palestinians at the hands of Israeli military forces. And then, of course, mass incarceration, which I also didn't understand was not just a uniquely American phenomenon. My visit to Palestine made clear that incarceration is a central figure of the ongoing Zionist settler colonial project. Palestinians face one of the highest per capita incarceration rates in the world. 1 in 5 Palestinians have been in prison at some point in their life, including 40% of Palestinian men. This is to say nothing of the fact that Israel is the only country in the world that prosecutes children in military courts, or that 99% of all cases tried in military court end in convictions, or to the systemic patterns of torture and human rights abuses that are rampant throughout Israeli prisons. But the last thing I want to say, and I'm going to stop, is the most important connection between African Americans, between African descended people and Palestinians, is not our common oppression, but as Robin D.G. Kelly, my favorite historian, says, that it is our common resistance and dreams of freedom. Solidarity should not be reduced to political similarity. It should grow from a moral commitment to fighting for the dignity, safety, and equality of everybody, of all life, the people, and the planet. I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation. Thank you again, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Ford, Dr. Callahan, Brother Jonathan, and our dear sister Donna for what you've seeded already to this education moment for us as a convention, but also for our country more broadly. Brother Katab, I have a question for you. We often hear, and particularly from one side of the aisle in this country, we often hear Israel referred to, the state of Israel referred to as the only democracy in the region, the only democracy in the Middle East. I wonder, what is democracy in the face of genocide? And I also ask, are there helpful ways to respond to charges of anti-Semitism associated with critiquing the Israeli government and military? Is there still prophetic space for critiquing governments and militaries?
Mhm.
Well, I'll start with the last one. I think a decision has been taken, a strategic decision, to weaponize the accusation of anti-Semitism to shield the state of Israel and the Zionist movement from any criticism. That has been written into laws through something that's called the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which gives examples of fighting Zionism and the state of Israel as being standard examples of what anti-Semitism means today. And therefore, they're asking institutions, governments, counties, progressives to adopt this definition as part of their resistance to hate speech and anti-Semitism. And once they adopt that definition, here it is. Any pro-Palestinian activity, any criticism of Zionism and the state of Israel becomes by definition anti-Semitic and therefore illegitimate and illegal. On the first part of your question, democracy really isn't just elections, although it is definitely elections. It is a system of participation in governments that includes elections, includes constitutional guarantees to the right of the individual and the minority against the majority, includes an independent judiciary, a free press, accountability for your political leaders, and includes, above all, equality. So you can't claim to be democratic if you're South Africa and you don't allow people to vote, or you make them vote for a lower house that covers the rights of blacks and coloreds. That's not democracy. If there isn't a basic equality built into the law, basic rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution against the government and against majorities, it's not a democracy. So Israel really isn't a democracy. They just had the wonderful good fortune of being in the midst of many dictatorial regimes which are illegitimate and which don't represent their people. So see, we're the only people who are democratic. We run elections. The others don't.
Mm.
That's, I think, the trick that is being played here.
Yeah, with that same analysis, it begs the question of whether or not this country, from sea to shining sea, is a real democracy. At least on paper, it's only been a multiracial democracy since my mother was 1 year old. 1 year old. So it does raise the question of, have we actually experienced the democracy anywhere in these places that claim to be harbingers of such? I wonder if Donna has a word to say about the charges of anti-Semitism related to the critique, the legitimate critique of violence, state-sponsored violence that we see from any government, but particularly the Israeli government.
Yes, and in fact, in our curriculum, we have an entire section on the IHRA definition and other ways that often we see it on college campuses where activists for justice are being penalized and shut down because they are, there's nothing anti-Semitic about what they're saying. To the contrary, they are standing up for human rights and justice. And so that's why, as part of our curriculum, it's not only what anti-Semitism is, but what I was saying is what it's not, but also we talk about who has the right to talk about anti-Semitism. Some will say, well, only Jewish people have the right. And of course, we honor the notion that those who are directly impacted are able to talk about something, but their own oppression. However, in the case of anti-Semitism, as we've been saying, it's been used to harm movements, Palestinians in particular, but also, and particularly also Black, now you were talking about the Black-Palestinian solidarity. It's been used to harm Black activists in our country, and we've seen it repeatedly happening, and other activists for justice. So I think it's really important for us also, when someone says, well, you don't have the right to speak about anti-Semitism, to say, no, that's a collective responsibility for all of us, both to speak out about real anti-Semitism and to challenge false accusations. And just to say one more thing about that, it harms the cause for justice. And it also harms the cause for fighting anti-Semitism. When you've got these mainstream Jewish organizations spending so much money and time challenging people like me and the organization I'm part of, Jewish Voice for Peace, and Palestinians and other committed activists who are speaking really out in support of human rights and justice. And as part of that, we believe very strongly in challenging anti-Semitism. So it's very, it's more than frustrating. It's something that I think, but we also need to be affirmative and to say, we're not going to let them define for us. We're going to reframe it, which is actually why the call for our curriculum came about. That's actually the real reason. People are like, we don't want to be reactive. We'd love to be putting something out there that has a framework that supports all of us working together for justice.
Dr. Callahan, you represent so much of the good of the prophetic tradition of Black churches, and we dare not assume that all Black churches lean into this prophetic tradition at any point in our history. But there is something I like to think about, that Brush Harbor tradition that's connected to prophetic folk like Harriet Tubman, prophetic folk like Fannie Lou Hamer, and we can name some of those more obvious giants of the civil rights movement. You mentioned something about our theologies that I wonder if you'd be willing to drill down in a bit. But are there aspects of some theologies and doctrines in Black churches that actually work against our solidarity for the struggle for peace and freedom in the region?
Well, that's a mouthful. Yes, I mean, to the last part, I think that there is, in fairness, my sister and colleague, Reverend Tracy Blackman, notes that there is no theology that should make genocide justifiable. And I think we should honor that. I don't think there's a theological perspective that wherein it logically follows that one should or would embrace genocide. But I do think that there are theological limitations to asking moral questions. There's some things that we can take for granted. And I am often reminded in the discussion, I think, Pastor Francois, you're the one who raised the relationship between Black people and the Exodus story. And I'm often reminded of Robert Warrior's essay, Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians, written from the perspective of Indigenous Americans who were cast as the Canaanites by white settlers who saw themselves as founding the new Israel. And they used biblical text as justifications for genocide.
Right.
Now, again, that's really no excuse. There have always been people within the traditions who said these texts and even these readings are not a justification for genocide. You do have the option, even within these theological traditions, to say no from a moral standpoint. But I do think there's a way that if we read for and take for granted certain assumptions about chosenness, about who God's people are and what God gives God's people, it can render us numb to horror and devastation. I think we have to be careful about the tradition we inherit as Christians. The doctrine of discovery, which is the Christian version of this, which allowed European powers in the name of the Lord to conquer people literally in the name of God, and to see the act of conquest itself as Christian. I think we have to be careful about how we read scripture and pass over violence within scripture, and take for granted bloodshed and horror and genocide. I think we have to, as Christian pastors and leaders and people who teach Bible and preach, I think it's incumbent upon us to draw the attention of the people and to draw our own attention to the reading of text in a way that doesn't just let us pass over and kill all of the people and slaughter all the, don't leave one person standing. I think it can numb us. I'll say one more thing. It's kind of ironic, right? That some of the same Christians who blamed video game play for violence in the streets can't see that their own telling of the story of God might make them insensitive to horror and devastation. And quite frankly, there is far more proof that reading texts can make you insensitive to genocide than there is that playing video games can make you insensitive to violence. We have hundreds of years of proof that the former is true. and much less proof that the latter is true. And so what I think it's incumbent upon us, particularly those who preach, we need to do our work, not to be insensitive ourselves, and not to allow our preaching to desensitize others in the name of God.
No, thank you for that. And also, I think it's always important to hold that juxtaposition about the way social location shifts our reading of scripture, which I hope robs us of the naivete that any of us are reading the Bible objectively, purely, most authoritatively. I think that's important. And particularly in this context, because it's been said that Black folk, particularly under the death making of the chattel regime, read themselves into the liberation story of Exodus. To be able to, which in fact they had to find themselves, because it was not given to them by the plantation religion that they were subjected to. But this idea that Black folk were able to read themselves into the liberation of the biblical Israelites, and white settlers, pilgrims were able to do the same thing when they were talking about a new Israel, and to focus on the inheritance of the promised land and the dislocation of the Canaanites and the other indigenous people. It's interesting how two groups from different vantages can see a biblical theme and find their way in it for very different purposes. But now, Dr. Ford,
Can I say one more thing about that?
Sure.
I believe that so much of how Black ancestors were able to do that had to do with their deep commitment to a perception about God that wasn't something somebody told them, but was something that they already knew, right? They believed something about God. They took for granted their own humanity. And what's, I think, been powerful about that is that I think in the best of the Black tradition, we've always taken for granted everybody else's humanity too. Like, we have been unwilling to, including white people's humanity.
Yeah.
We've appealed to it. And so I think that's the best of the tradition. And I think I think yes, we're all reading ourselves into it. And I also want to say at the same time, there are better readings and less good readings, right? And I think that the less good reading is the one for much of the biblical record. Much of it is written by people who were under siege.
Yeah.
Who were either coming out of siege or going into siege, or who are on the verge of siege. And I think when powerful people read themselves into the text, I think they offer a less good reading. And I think we ought to be able to say that, even as we can acknowledge that everybody is reading from some perspective. But when we read from the position of the powerful, we can't understand. We don't understand the cross when you read as a Roman.
Yeah. Yeah, no, brother. Now you can add to this, but I'll throw something else out there, and you can respond to it. You can go back to where we've gone. Anybody can respond to what I'm going to say after now goes. But I'm curious, just thinking about militarism itself, and you were on militarized streets in Ferguson. You have been on militarized streets in Palestine. Can you underscore any ways that the project of American exceptionalism vis-a-vis American imperialism, American militarism, contributes to the historical and this historic devastation in the region? And does any of that map onto this legendary anti-Blackness that is connected to American exceptionalism?
Man, what an easy question. I thought you were going to ask me something difficult. That was a joke, y'all. I don't know if I can. I'll try. I mean, part of the very identity of the United States is the U.S. military. There is absolutely no way of understanding not just the United States, but nation states Like part of what makes a nation state is a monopoly on the coercive use of power.
Mhm.
If we don't understand that, then one, we don't understand what we are actually a citizen of.
Mm.
Two, we don't understand the way to engage that kind of society that is literally baked into it, a military impulse, a policing apparatus. And then we don't know how to envision something different. And so when Dr. King stood on the pulpit of the Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967, and he spoke out against the hypocrisies of US imperialism in Vietnam, he didn't stop there. He understood that the military budget that was being used to drop napalm on Vietnamese babies could be funding that could go to schools in Chicago. So when we take a step back and understand what actually is not just America, but a nation state, then we have a better understanding of how we can then engage it and then how we can envision something different. So of course, there's connections between the US military, which receives an enormous amount of money, despite its brutality. The police and US police experiences an enormous amount of money. I'm like, we always have money for policing, but very, very little for schools, very, very little for community centers, very, very little for healthcare. How can we not get universal healthcare, but we have universal military bases all across the world? So until even as Christians and as theologians, as people who preach this, divest ourselves from the idea that the only way that we can respond to violence, sufferings, inequality is through arming primarily poor people and oppressed people to hurt other poor people and oppressed people. If that is the limit of our theological and political imagination, we'll never make it out of this. So I so appreciate Jonathan Katab. I so appreciate Donna Neville, you, Leslie Callahan, and a long tradition of people who said, this isn't a war over Palestine versus Israel. Like it wasn't a war of Vietnam versus the United States. It's about a peace with justice or a violent society. These are our options. And this goes back to the question also of getting trapped into a kind of logic of anti-Semitism, right? We're not fighting over nation states. This is a deeply spiritual battle against the very notion of militarism, which creeps up into our own, I'm just all over the place, but I'm just trying to share a little bit, creeps up in our own kind of theological imagines, the way that we police our own congregants, the way that we police our own sense of how we raise families, how we rear children, of the way that we educate ourselves in schools where you have to walk in a single file line, where you have to tell a kid to be quiet. Like it's so baked into. So I think just broadly understanding what nationalism is, militarism is, making that connection to our own faith, and really engaging in a project. What would a world look like without military?
Yes.
Such a radical question. If you're watching us on YouTube or Facebook, please feel free at this point to drop questions into the chat so that our esteemed panelists will be able to respond to you, your ideas, your curiosities directly. So if you do have questions, please put those in the chat, and we will do our best to field as many of them as possible. Donna, I want to go to you, but Jonathan, you may also be helpful for this as well, for different reasons. But I'm thinking about this legacy of the black churches and prophetic imagination and praxis within the Black church. I've always been clear that Black churches have done anti-racism pretty well, right? Probably better than many other American institutions, right? While also honoring the fact that Black churches are American institutions in a lot of ways, right? but the anti-Blackness, the anti-racism piece has been more prevalent in its work, in its witness in the world. I remember James Baldwin saying that something along the lines, we must do something revolutionary, create ourselves without the need for an enemy, right? And we get anti-racism pretty good. We don't do well with patriarchy. We don't do well with classism. I'll stop with that list because I don't want to distract from the concept right here, and you all know what I could be thinking about right now. But we're not good on some of the other anti-oppression areas. Can you help us, particularly you, Donna, think about how as Black churches, as faith communities, and I know I'm asking you this as somebody who lives outside that tradition, but friendly to it, how can we think about the anti-racism work that we do as Black churches alongside the call to fight anti-Semitism and the call to fight Islamophobia? How can we hold all of those things together as the practice of faith, as the practice of people who are following somebody who wasn't a Christian by the name of Jesus?
Well, I just want to start with a little story from the protest today, because it really like hit a number of us. So one of the reporters came up to me and said, "So you're Jewish?" I was one of the organizers, and it was Jews speaking out against the against genocide against the Palestinians. And she said, "I just wanted to ask you, I've noticed that you've been speaking like you're very close with a lot of the Muslim activists who are here." And she said it in a way as if that was very strange. And I said, "I'm not sure where your question's coming from, but we've worked together for years and years. We are bonded because of our commitment to justice and love for each other's traditions and histories. And we come together to fight for justice. And when there's Islamophobia, you know, my organization had a Hanukkah action to challenge Islamophobia. And when there's anti-Semitism that happens, the mosques reach out, members from the mosque reach out. Like, we have been connected and working together. And I always say to people, it's not about saying, oh, now we're going to let's invite a Black person, let's invite a Muslim, you know, if you're planning an event. It's about building those long, deep relationships. And really, like, when I said about community education, one of the reasons I am so passionate about it is because, to me, it's not about hitting people over the head. It's about really getting sort of the values and the commitments that we share. And then, because we all have places. I mean, I was brought up to not know, I didn't know about the Nakba, and I didn't know about what happened in 48. And of course, it's not because it wasn't out there. Palestinians have been documenting it for decades, as have others, but it's not what I learned in my Jewish education. So I think part of it is for each of us in our different spaces to come together, to share our resources, our curricula, our ideas, our thinking, so that we can build from the ground up together, right from the beginning. I always say to people, who's in the room when you have that first conversation? It's not about at the end saying, oh, well, we didn't invite this one, but who's in the room? So I remain very committed to building in that way. And I think it's not only possible, but I see it as sort of our future of how we can really, you know, when I say collective liberation, I don't mean it just as rhetoric, but how we can really, you know, have that happen in practice. So that's sort of my answer to that question.
Jonathan, anyone else want to think about how we hold anti-racism, you know, how we attack anti-Black racism, and we should also be engaged in you know, attacking anti-Semitism and Islamophobia?
Well, I have what could be an answer, but it's on a slightly different level. I have never been so impressed with how corporate media frames issues and directs conversations as I have during the last 10 days. And I'll give you one example which pulls us back to where we are now. Thanks to somebody who has leaked documents that the State Department was using, directing news agencies as well as its diplomats abroad with a specificity that is unbelievable. Do not use words like ceasefire, de-escalation, reducing the level of violence. Literally don't use these words. My God, we haven't heard that. When people were talking about how horrible things are, Not one person was saying, let's hold off. Let's cease fire, at least enough to allow people to exchange prisoners or the wounded. Nobody was allowed to use the word de-escalation.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, that word de-escalation was prohibited. My God.
Wow.
Wow.
When have you ever heard of any struggle anywhere in the world? The first thing that happens is that Security Council comes around and calls for a ceasefire and asks for people to de-escalate and avoid danger to both sides. Literally, in this free society, it has become possible for the government to tell the major news agencies, and they do it. And they did it. For 10 days, we haven't heard the words de-escalation, ceasefire. Right now, especially after what's happened today, the new call should be, at least, at minimum, please ceasefire. Please stop. Give people a chance. Hamas has just said it's willing to release the civilians, including the Israeli civilians and all of the foreigners. Just physically, how can we do that with the bombs falling? And instead of jumping on that opportunity and saying, wow, let's get those people released,
Right.
instead there's a silence. Don't use the word ceasefire. Don't negotiate. Don't discuss. Just send them more weapons, more rockets, because we need to totally and utterly destroy them.
Mm.
So I've never seen an example of corporate news media actually controlling the discussion to this level. This is a country with First Amendment.
Wow.
Free speech is supposed to be so basic. Everybody should be able to say whatever they want. And yet the government has the ability, and the corporate media has the ability to determine the discussion down to which words are being used.
Mm.
Mhm.
We need to understand what we are struggling against. Because if we don't, the other side will set the perimeters. And within those perimeters, you can be right-wing, left-wing, more liberal, more conservative, because the discussion has already been determined.
Mm-hmm.
The perimeters have been set, and you have been told what you can talk about and what you cannot talk about. Right now, what we need to talk about is a ceasefire.
Yes.
Yes.
Just a ceasefire, please. A ceasefire.
Yes.
Give a chance to have some humanitarian aid come in to the innocents. Water, food, medical supplies, electricity. And then we can work on everything else. And you can resume your fighting, yes. But at least a ceasefire. Something so basic.
Yes.
We don't see it.
Can I say something really quickly? Because I know we have to do a call to action, and I see folks saying, what can we do? So we're going to get to that in 1 minute. And I see
Sorry.
Fred Sullivan also saying, what news outlets? IMEU, Institute for Middle Eastern Understanding, is a wonderful one that Donna Neville introduced to me. There are many more. Let's try to put them in the chat before this is over. But I would definitely start with IMEU, Institute for Middle Eastern Understanding. There's a website. I'll just say really quickly, morally, justice is indivisible. Morally, that is our tradition. That
Right.
justice is absolutely individual. There's no partial justice. There's no half justice. There's no quarter-baked justice. Justice is indivisible. Injustice anywhere. We love to quote Dr. King on certain things, but not when other issues come up. In any issue, he didn't say on certain issues, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That's important. And it's politically important. How can you fight anti-racism when you're not fighting specifically about Black women? They're Black. How could you fight for Black people if you're not fighting in the climate? Because 35% of African American families live near a coal plant.
Right.
There is absolutely no way to fight against racism without fighting against every single system that's bound up in that. And the second thing I'll say is, I understand anti-Semitism as another form of racism.
Mhm.
It is a part of the larger ideology of racism. Jewish people, Italian people, Irish people were not always considered white in what's now the United States. Cedric Robinson talks about how there were racialized Eastern European peoples even before the transatlantic slave trade.
Right.
Racialization is beyond anti-Black racism. There are many forms of racism, anti-Black racism being one of them. So if we're truly going to be an anti-racist church, that means being anti-racist across the board. So I just wanted to add that.
That's good. Dr. Callahan?
I want to co-sign what Jonathan said. I clearly agree with you, Niall. I want to co-sign what Jonathan said, and I want to place it in a context that Black folks, I think, will all understand. We all know that when somebody is killed, particularly in an extrajudicial way, or sometimes in a judicial way via the death penalty, etc., before we know anything about what happens, we learn all of the reasons why it's not that bad that this particular Black person was killed. We learn about every parking ticket. We learn about every accusation. It is the same sort of media framing, and it's not accidental. And in the same way that we have learned, I think we should have learned by now, maybe we haven't, but we should have learned by now, never, ever to take at face value the first statement that comes from law enforcement on the other side of one of these killings. You just don't, you can never take that as face value. George Floyd had a medical emergency in custody. That's what the police report says, effectively. You can never take that at first value. We have learned, hold up a minute and wait for some more stuff to come out. I think one thing that we can do as it relates to our consumption of media, one is to try to find better outlets. The other is to be a bit more suspicious in our readings and be like, you know what? Something about that don't sound right. And at least before we carry the tale as it's been offered to us, we ought to ask a question or two about whether what's being told to us, like what's missing from this story. So this is something we've learned to do. This is something we need to do in general.
Sure.
We need to do it with this conflict as well. We need to ask ourselves some questions.
We've spent, and I know we have to move to the call to action. We're right at time, but I do not want to blink at one of the questions, actually the only other question that we received in the chat. And it brings us back to these questions of alterity, of difference, of otherness and othering. And we did talk about the places where Black churches have gotten things wrong, but we do know that many religions other and damn and condemn and punish in very physical terms others. One of our viewers asked the question, telling us about some of the pro-Israeli people in the queer community are raising questions about how a queer person could be in solidarity with Palestinians when in Palestine you could be killed for being gay. How do we respond to that question, that which is more of a critique than it really is a question? I don't think it's an honest question from the people who are asking our brother, who are asking our sibling this. But how would we respond? How would you help someone respond to that question?
Well, I would admit very clearly, I think it's exaggerated. You don't get killed for being gay, certainly not in Palestine. But yes, it is still frowned upon. It is not accepted. It is difficult for Palestinians. The church, which has taken so long to begin to deal with some of these issues with women and equality. You said we haven't done enough as a church with women and equality. Gays 10, 15, 10 years ago, in most churches in this country were still, the gay issue was a very, very pivotal one and not really given the equality it deserves. We in Palestine haven't reached that level yet. I'm afraid this is one of the problems we still have, to reach that level of acceptance of LGBTQ people and their rights. Yeah, we have a problem. We have some ways to go in Palestinian community. In fact, the Israelis who always claim that they are good with that, they use that to get gay people, gay Palestinians, to turn them into collaborators. Otherwise, we will reveal to your community that you are gay and therefore create problems for you within your own society for being gay. So still, Palestinian society is not open to gay people and giving them equal rights. And this is something we haven't done very well as a community, and we have to accept that. Also, equality for women. We have a long way to go, and we must admit that. And I love when we talk liberation theology. I love the fact that we have to understand that it's an ongoing struggle and that we have to be willing to speak the truth at all levels, to all sectors of society. And we have to be critical of ourselves as we are critical of the other. So, yes, we do have a problem when it comes to homosexuality in Palestinian society. We still have a long way to go. I should say we have started making progress. We don't have, as you say, outright killing of people for being gay in the Palestinian community. At least I'm not aware of any cases. We don't have acceptance for homosexuality yet. It's one of these issues that we need to work more on. But Israel is not this is what they call trying to wash
Pink washing.
the occupation, and it should not be allowed. I think there is a way to go in the Palestinian community before we achieve equality within our own society for gays or for women.
Just, I know we have to run, but just one last question, since it did come in, and then we'll move to our call to action. We will be done before 8:40, hopefully, definitely 8:45, depending on how this goes. We have someone in chat who's actually from our church, who is saying, how do we help to shift the mindset of people who say that what's happening to the Palestinians now is justified because of the attack 10 days ago? How do we respond to that?
I would start, I think where for me it starts, which is a refusal to lump 2 million people in Gaza into a nameless, faceless blob that dehumanizes them, that doesn't acknowledge that their humanity. Let's put it in the most specific terms. So what you are saying is that it is okay to commit genocide in response to terrorism. I mean, I think we start there.
Yeah.
On its face, it's wrong. On its face, the bombing of a hospital and killing 500 mostly sick people is just wrong. I think it only works to say that this makes sense if we don't acknowledge that there are human beings, that they're people. Gaza is not just land. There are people. I think the way that Jonathan put it earlier was really specific. 5 to 8 miles across, like 2 million people in this space. I think that's where we start. And it may be that people think it's cool And then we should move on to talking to somebody else. Because,
Good point.
I mean, if you think genocide is okay, you're going to think genocide is okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's this snapshot phenomena. Look at them out there rioting and burning and stealing, and that sort of wipes out the entire history of slavery and racism and Jim Crow and discrimination and systematic injustice and racism, because they're out there looting and rioting and burning. You take that snapshot of particular activity, which is wrong, should not be condoned, and then you forget the entire context of the struggle which has brought it to that point. You know, I keep saying that, you know, people in prison who eventually riot and break out of that prison, boy, they act like animals. Anybody who stands in their way, don't expect them to be acting like proper pacifists. Because, you know, actually, Gazans tried walking peacefully towards that fence. 62 people were killed in one day by snipers who knew where every single bullet was going. Hundreds of meters before they reached the fence, they were all picked off in one day, 62 of them. So, as a person who believes in nonviolence, that's hard for me to say, well, you know what? If you can break through that fence and go through, and people go wild. And yes, people commit murder against civilians and against children and old women and capture them and take them as hostage, all of which is wrong. But you can't take that snapshot and say, okay, this is what defines the Israeli-Palestinian struggle, and from here on out, we need to totally obliterate those. Literally, they use those words: obliterate, wipe out, demolish, completely annihilate. Sorry, shouldn't be done.
Thank you. Thank you.
If I can add really, really quick, I think we just need a complete political clarity of what the root of the violence is. If we say we want to stop violence, then the way we stop violence is not picking off the strange fruit. We know this as Black people. It's not picking off the strange fruit that keeps on growing. It's saying, why does this tree keep on growing strange fruit? It must be something wrong with the root of this tree. The root of the tree of this particular form of violence and oppression did not happen October 7th, did not start in 2000 with the Second Intifada. It started with the very project of Israeli settler colonialism. When you go into a place where people already live, you steal their land, you displace them, you make people into 7 million to 8 million refugees, you build a nation state on top of what used to be historic Palestine, you put a wall around them and keep them trapped in an open air prison, over 2 million people. This is not to suggest the tactics where I'm not getting into that debate. But it is to say that we have to have complete political clarity of the root of the violence if we want to stop the violence. The root of the violence is not responses to violence, which we can debate and condemn all day, but it's dishonest. You know, it is not a perfect analogy, but when they kill a Black kid, which we know very well, and then people start to riot in those communities, they do the same exact thing. Look at these kids throwing Mazel cocktails. Look at these kids burning down buildings. Look at these kids. But the initial violence that caused that reaction is oftentimes left out of the story. We have to be clear about the initial violence that precipitated the response to that violence, regardless of what we think about the response to that violence. We need that kind of political clarity. Sorry, I'm taking time.
No, it reminds me, and all of what has been said in responses reminds me of those words of Frederick Douglass: "What caused the rebellion is worse than the rebellion." And we must hold that seriously as we think about what peace and liberation will mean for the region. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Dr. Callahan. Thank you, Dr. Fort, for your leadership tonight and for the ways you are committed to truth telling, to Parisia, to the prophetic tradition of caring for and sounding the alarm and living in solidarity with all peoples. It's that altar call moment. There are things that you can do, simple things, easy things to do on a very complex issue. One is attend a protest. They are pretty easy to find on social media these days, particularly protests that affirm the dignity of all life that is being lost right now, and also honors the complexity of what is happening in the region, that also focuses on the root causes of what happened just days ago that get us to this moment. So find a protest. Some of those resources will be in the chat, so please look at the chat to locate some of those resources. Learn more. There are tons of literature and websites that are also in the chat that will allow you to figure out just exactly what you can do. You can also host a teaching. Third action item, you can host a teaching. You have some wonderful thought leaders, faith leaders, leaders of faith who are with us on this screen. And if you reach out to the convention through IPM, we will be sure to connect you with one of these leaders that can help in teaching practice process. It is my encouragement that you would find someone to lead teach-ins that represent the perspectives that we offered tonight. Every educator in this area, every advocate in this area is not committed to peace and liberation. So you do want to expose your community, your families, to persons who hold the types of perspectives that we offer today. And then finally, whenever we have a Speaker of the House, and you know, yeah, we want to call Congress. We want to make sure that our congressional leaders in both chambers of Congress understand where we stand as the American public, and that we will not allow the media to drive the real interests of the American people, which we know that often impacts the direction of tax dollars. And so I am encouraging you to call your senator, call your congressperson. And these are two demands that are coming out of Gaza, two demands that are coming out of Gaza. One is the call for immediate de-escalation and protection of civilians. And the second is the entry of humanitarian assistance and safe delivery of aid in the Gaza Strip. So demand number one, immediate de-escalation, a call for an immediate ceasefire. And two, a call for the protection of civilians and the establishment of safe zones in the Gaza Strip. The second demand for our sisters and brothers in Congress is the entry of humanitarian assistance, which we know will be life-saving and life-sustaining. We want the safe passage of humanitarian aid and medical supplies from Egypt through the Rafah crossing. This must be safeguarded by the international community. Secondly, a part of this second demand is protection of safe, secure, and timely delivery of humanitarian assistance to the affected population inside the Gaza Strip. And the last piece of the second demand is resuming access to water and electricity, as well as fuel for medical facilities in the Gaza Strip. These are our demands. Congress has the wherewithal to do these things. The question is, will they have the political will and the moral courage? And generally, with people who live looking at their next election, it's up to you. It's up to us to make those calls, make those demands. So thank you all for coming to be with us tonight, for logging in, for lending us your questions, lending us your ears, and for practicing virtual sacred presence with us as we consider yes, the loss of life in the Gaza Strip, but also the wild imagination that peace can happen, can materialize, and be anchored there in our lifetime and for the rest of the existence of humanity. God bless. Enjoy.
Thank you, Pastor Willie. Thank you, everybody. Y'all take care.
Thank you.